Hey everyone, it's Colin. How's it going? In late October 2018, Apple finally updated some of its long neglected Mac models. But not everyone's thrilled about it. So at the very tail end of October, Apple had a special presentation in New York City to announce some new products. And this, of course, follows the iPhone announcement previously in the year when it was just the iPhones that were being talked about. Kind of left a lot of people disappointed about, well, what about the rest of Apple's product lineup? The second half of this show in New York City was all about the new iPad Pro with thinner bezels and faster processors. They announced a new version of the Apple Pencil that finally charges wirelessly and doesn't look stupid hanging out the Lightning port on the iPads. And those iPads, the new ones, they're certainly interesting products, but it seemed like a lot of people were kind of bored during that part of the show. And I think it's because most of us kind of saw those features coming. We all kind of realized, iPhone had ditched the bezels. It's likely the iPad would go that way too. Performance improvements were going to be kind of a given. I mean, we've seen that year over year in these mobile products. So it was just kind of a, yeah, okay, that's nice type of thing reaction. Though I will admit, these new iPads definitely do reinforce just how big of a gap there is between iPads specifically and Android tablets. I'm not sure what's going on with the Android tablet market these days, other than there being just a whole ton of really low-end, inexpensive ones. Where's the true competition to like the iPad Pro on the Android side of things? Why aren't we seeing more of that? Anyway, what really seemed to get people jazzed from that presentation was the promise of new Mac models. The only Mac that Apple had updated in 2018 to the point of that presentation were just the new MacBook Pros with Touch Bar. And even then, it wasn't that big of an update. They kept the same form factor, just some minor tweaks. And the biggest thing was a spec bump with new CPUs, which you may remember the whole thermal throttling thing. Turns out it was a firmware bug, and we don't quite know what was going on with that. What really did get updated during this presentation were a couple of models. What we were expecting to see updated, like the most likely things to see updated at this presentation, were the iMac, the 12-inch MacBook, and then maybe the 13-inch non-touch bar MacBook Pro. Those all, I think, were kind of shoo-ins to see updates simply because it would have been so easy for Apple to do so. They would have just been spec bumps as well, just put faster CPUs in there and that sort of thing. Interestingly enough, none of those three models were even mentioned during the presentation. And what actually got updates, substantial ones, were two products that were desperately in need of either getting a dramatic update or Apple finally just saying, we're going to discontinue this. Those two models being the MacBook Air and the Mac Mini. So the 13-inch MacBook Air, it's been Apple's most popular laptop for a long time now. And I think it's largely due to a just solid combination of size and weight, performance, and price. It's not the most amazing when it comes to being the smallest and lightest. The 12-inch MacBook is definitely smaller and lighter, and even the 13-inch MacBook Pro, up until this point, had been a little bit thinner. But the MacBook Air always represented just a really solid, consumer-oriented laptop if you wanted a Mac. And so I think there was a lot of confusion about the MacBook Air, especially since it had been over 3 years since the machine saw an update. And what's more, the price had stayed the same the entire time. So getting a brand new MacBook Air model was, I think, both a relief and a surprise. It's very similar in design, but quite a bit different in some other ways. It has a Retina display now, as we probably all would have expected. It uses the T2 chip, just like in the MacBook Pro and the iMac Pro, and we'll definitely see this in other Macs going forward. It's that chip that kind of integrates a whole bunch of system functions together, like audio and video and the storage controller and embedded security and all that kind of stuff, now has the solid state touchpad, so it doesn't physically go down when you click it. So it's got the haptic feedback. And it's got, of course, a thinner, lighter design, especially afforded by the butterfly keyboard that everyone seems to be very polarized about. Plus the move to just a pair of USB Type-C ports that do Thunderbolt 3. And interestingly enough, the machine keeps the headphone jack. So all that together makes the MacBook Air even a little bit smaller, a little bit thinner, a little bit lighter weight than the previous version. Part of that also comes from a big change with the processor, though. MacBook Air used to use U-series Intel laptop CPU parts. Apple decided to move to a lower wattage Intel Y-series CPU with the MacBook Air. And it's going to give up a bit of performance, but I think that's also Apple kind of drawing a bit of a more firm line between the Air and the Pro models. I have no doubt that this Y-series CPU for general consumer use is going to be just fine in terms of performance. No, you're not going to be buying a MacBook Air to run video editing or, really computationally heavy tasks, but I don't think that's been what people have bought the Air before anyway. So again, it's kind of coming down to this balance between size and weight and performance and everything. And we see this across the computer industry. This isn't just an Apple thing, of course. But the overall, the whole package, it seems like it was a very compelling update, and a lot of people seem to have been very happy with that change. The bigger one is the move to the Mac Mini and like where it's getting positioned and all of the changes that happened to it. It's been 4 years since the Mac Mini saw an update. The last one was in 2014, and people were, I think, getting more to the point of thinking that Apple was just going to discontinue it rather than update it. And I'm sure a lot of those people are glad that they were wrong, because Apple did a major upgrade to the Mac Mini. It's the same enclosure, but it has just way better specifications to it. The biggest change is the move to desktop class CPUs. Previously, the Mac Mini had always used mobile parts, laptop CPUs, because of its small size, need for thermal management, power consumption, all of that. Apple's just throwing desktop class chips inside this thing and is offering a quad-core i3 as the base chip, and that even still performs pretty decently. It only has Intel integrated video, the one built into the CPU. There's no discrete GPU. That's not surprising, really, because the Mac Mini traditionally just relied on integrated graphics. But it has 4 Thunderbolt 3 ports on the back that also double as USB Type-C ports, and so you can use an eGPU. And Apple actually is kind of recommending this. They were pushing that a bit with the way that they presented the Mac Mini. If you need more powerful graphics, hey, go buy an eGPU, plug it in. It's natively supported in the Mac OS now. But the big, huge development that I think is going way underreported, it's a small thing in terms of its technical change, but it has really big ramifications, and that is the RAM. Apple went back to modular SODIMMs instead of keeping the RAM soldered down to the motherboard. That was a big change that Apple made in the Mac Mini in 2014. The previous model that came out in 2012, I have one of those, has modular RAM. 2014, Apple decided to solder the RAM down to the board like it does in its laptops, and that got a lot of people worked up. Apple's actually moving back to modular RAM in the Mac Mini, and it looks like it's going to be relatively easy for end users to upgrade it. This is the first time that I can ever recall seeing Apple actually walk back a highly integrated change like it's done, where it's gone from soldered down components or something that's hard to repair and moved it back to more of an industry standard. Whether this is going to stick, whether we're going to see this in more of Apple's products, I don't know, but it's a very big and very welcome development. And I really hope, and I think a lot of other people hope, that at least that sentimentality continues on with Apple's other products that still have some modular parts. Maybe it'll actually spur Apple to make some changes to its other things. I think the laptops are a little bit too far gone with the whole desire for thin and light, but maybe iMac Pro, maybe the next generation of that will have a little door on the back like the 27-inch iMac does, and you can actually upgrade your own RAM again. Hopefully this is a step in the right direction, but maybe that also has to do with the way that the Mac Mini was positioned. And this is another thing that's a big change to the machine, but not in terms of hardware. Apple talked quite a bit during that presentation about how the Mac Mini was perfect now for professional use, for things like content creators, video editing, graphic design, audio production, that sort of thing. Things that traditionally need a more powerful computer with more expandability, more capability. In so many words, Apple was kind of pitching the Mac Mini, this new model, as being a good solution for those who want the power of a desktop, but didn't necessarily want to buy an iMac. In so many words, it's kind of like they were saying, yeah, we know you want the Mac Pro, but how about this? Like, maybe you try this. Hey, look, it's less expensive and it does a lot of the stuff you want. And Apple actually kind of went to great pains to pitch the Mac Mini along those lines, even to the point of recommending that people buy more than one and using them like in parallel to break their tasks up among them. They even had apparently in the demo area, they even had a section where they were like 5 Mac Minis stacked right on top of each other, like showing off some kind of scenario where you had this big multi-monitor set up and you just broke them up into different tasks and purposes. You know, it was very different, and they didn't really mention at all how the Mac Mini had kind of always traditionally been like a so-called halo product for the Mac lineup, where for a long time it was, the cheapest Mac you could buy, and it was meant for those who maybe wanted to try the Mac OS for the first time. Maybe they were a long-time PC user and they got sick of dealing with Windows or whatever, and they wanted to try a Mac, but they didn't want to go out and rebuy a monitor and keyboard and mouse and all the accessories. They didn't want to put a ton of money into it. The Mac Mini was great for that. It was also great for software developers, people who maybe wanted to get into iOS or Mac software development. Maybe they already had an existing product that worked on Android and Windows, and they wanted to maybe offer it on these other platforms as well. Well, Apple makes you use Xcode to write your software for its platforms. So, the Mac Mini was very appealing for those people too, because it was the lowest cost solution to getting into something like that. And it seems like Apple's just not really talked about that anymore. It doesn't really seem to be the focus. And that's really unfortunate, especially given another development from this whole presentation. It's something that wasn't quite as widely reported, but it still did get a little bit coverage, and that is everything announced during this fall update from Apple got a price hike. Every single new product that Apple talked about was more expensive than the product that it replaced. Some of those price hikes were modest, like the Apple Pencil went from $100 to $130. Not a huge deal. Some prices, though, were dramatic, like the base model Mac Mini used to be $500. Base model is now $800. $300 price hike for the Mac Mini. And it kind of takes it out of that, well, let's just, it's cheap, it's $500, we'll just buy one and noodle around with it kind of territory, into, well, geez, for $800, I could buy a really good PC. Am I sure I want to try out this whole Mac thing? And then perhaps one of the biggest price changes, or biggest affecting price changes, it wasn't the largest change itself, was that of the MacBook Air. It went up $200, which isn't a whole ton of money in the grand scheme of things. But when the MacBook Air was $1,000, $999 is the way Apple advertises it. And that's a number that obviously people have been willing to go for when they wanted to buy a Mac laptop. It's, again, part of one of the major reasons as to why I think the MacBook Air was Apple's most popular machine for a very long time, is because of that price. It's now $200 more expensive. Does it cost Apple, an iterative amount more to make that machine? Yeah, maybe. Maybe the parts cost went up for them a bit, and so it's not necessarily unwarranted to see a price hike. However, well, I think it's going to deter some buyers. I think it's going to take the MacBook Air and actually the entire MacBook lineup and position it just a little bit higher up. And we're going to see fewer people interested in necessarily buying these machines. And what's even more frustrating is Apple actually kept the 2015 model MacBook Air around at that $1,000 price point. And that's obviously a pricing strategy that they want to do. They want to keep something at that price, but it's doing a disservice to those customers because they're buying a 3-year-old machine for the same price that they could have paid for it 3 years ago when it was brand new and had state-of-the-art specs. It's really off-putting to see Apple doing something like that. I would have rather that they split the difference. I would have rather that they discontinue that 2015 model MacBook Air, announce this new one exactly as it is with all the specs that it has, but only increase the price by like $100 if they had to. I would have really preferred that they would have just eaten that cost and taken a smaller margin, but I think the terms small margin and Apple are mutually exclusive at this point. So even at $100 price increase, I think that would have been okay for people. It would have put a bigger difference between the MacBook Air and the low-end MacBook Pro. And it would have maybe continued that momentum of, hey, you want to try a Mac? That's cool. Go buy the MacBook Air. It's a really solid deal when it comes to buying a Mac, of course. And I'm sure tons of people down in the comments have already started freaking out about how Macs are a horrible value. We talked about this a while back. Sometimes they're a horrible value, sometimes not. Depends on what you buy. Anyway, I guess Apple is maybe trying to move the Mac further away from being a consumer-oriented product. I think in so many words, Apple is trying to put a bigger split between the iOS and Mac product lines. I mean, Apple for a long time said, no, it's not going to be merging the Mac OS and iOS. And at this point, I believe them, that they're not going to merge the two. But maybe the loophole for them is, well, we don't need to merge the two if we can just get everyone to use iOS who doesn't need something with a ton of horsepower or wants to have that kind of, I guess, legacy computing workflow, if we're even ready to start calling a keyboard and mouse legacy. It seems like, especially with the announcement of the new iPad Pro taking up like half of the presentation, Apple is really sending that signal of, look, this is the direction we want you to go. And the prices on the iPad Pro are less. You could definitely option those to be very expensive, more expensive than a Mac. But the base model iPad Pros, which should be sufficient for a lot of people, are still a lot less than Apple's cheapest Mac. So, I think that's gotten some people worked up. I think that's where the frustration from the Mac faithful out of this presentation is really coming from, is they saw a lot of hope, and they were really given kind of a double-edged sword with this one. I mean, the products that Apple had been neglecting the most, the MacBook Air and the Mac Mini, finally saw substantial updates. From a technical perspective, again, they're great updates, but the other side of it was their prices went up too. You're paying for those updates, perhaps even not like in line with the level of performance or a level of functionality you're getting. You're just paying more because Apple thinks it can get away with it. And so that, I think, has the Mac faithful getting a little bit more worried, as we've seen Mac prices trend upwards more and more over time. I can understand that they're not going down over time, but at the same point, there's a lot to be said for sticking with, fairly tightly defined price points to segment out these products. And it seems like those lines are getting blurred with each other. So a lot of the Big Mac fans, I think, are getting worried that they're going to be kind of priced out of their platform, or that it's going to price newcomers to the platform out of it. That people are going to look at that new MacBook Pro that starts at, $1,500, or the increased pricing on the 15-inch MacBook Pro, which is a lot more money. And even the MacBook Air, that's now $200 more. Maybe the average consumer will look at that and go, well, I could do $1,000, like that would have been kind of my upper limit, but $1,200, I don't think so. And then maybe they look at the $1,000 MacBook Air and go, it's a 3-year-old model. No, I think I'm going to go buy this PC instead. It's understandable that Mac fans are a little bit worried about this, because it could definitely mean that their overall market share is going to start shrinking again. And it brings back all these terrible memories of like the mid 90s and how big of a mess Apple was and how big of a mess the Mac product lineup was. And we don't want to go there again. Now, at the same time, I think it also is worth paying attention to on the side of like PC users, right? I mean, for the longest time, PC users always just sat there and talked shit about Apple. And that's like the time-honored tradition, right? Everyone just talks shit about Apple. That's fine. But it's worth them paying attention to it because it really represents two things. One, of course, the opportunity to talk trash. Haha, your computers are now even more expensive for the same, if not worse performance than an equivalent PC, blah, 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 whatever. But at the same time, it also potentially leaves a little bit of uncertainty as to the future of their own platform. I mean, like it or not, other companies often copy Apple. Apple is a bit of an industry trendsetter. There are seemingly increasingly fewer companies that really kind of set that trend when it comes to where technology is going, and Apple's influence has gotten larger and larger as time has gone on. Some trends stick, of course, and some trends don't, thankfully. And things like cider down components, though, and like bigger emphasis on overall product design versus serviceability or upgradability, well, they're starting to show a foothold on the PC side as well. I mean, even Microsoft is starting to play that game. Microsoft got into building its own hardware, and a lot of it is designed in very similar fashion to Apple. It's no more serviceable. In fact, in some ways, it's less serviceable. I've seen a lot of the teardowns on Microsoft's computing products, and they seem to use even more adhesive inside than Apple does. But, you know, it's not going to change the industry overnight. And yeah, there's always going to be ways to build your own PCs and upgrade them. But it's something worth paying attention to. I think the scope of the enthusiast PC user is going to start shrinking more and more than it already has. And so it's worth at least paying attention to these developments. And even if you don't like Apple, even if you have absolutely no intention of buying an Apple product, it's important to support things that ultimately push the industry in the direction you want it to go, like Apple moving back to SODIMM modules in the Mac Mini. Because you know what? Then maybe they'll do it for other products. And then maybe the rest of the industry will start doing it. And then the same thing with other companies, non-Apple companies that you see doing things that are a little bit more consumer friendly, making things easier to repair, making things easier to upgrade, extending the lifespan of stuff. Basically, you know, empowering the user again into not just buying this sealed appliance, but rather into getting the most that they can for their money over the long term. If you ever see companies do stuff like that, consumer-friendly things, definitely give them feedback about that. Tell them that's something that you want, because then they may do it more, and then the rest of the industry may do it more, and then we all win for it. So, you know, this whole Apple event thing really kind of 50-50 good and bad. Some positive development, the fact that Apple hasn't completely forgotten about the Mac platform. And I should mention, I think the reason Apple didn't upgrade the iMacs, the regular iMacs, is because the faster CPUs would have put them in too close to performance of the iMac Pro, which sells for substantially more money. So again, coming back to the whole money thing and Apple not wanting to reduce prices or margins or anything like that, which is definitely frustrating. But, you know, it's like, Apple, okay, fine. They've heard the fans. They've heard people will produce new computers for you. But at the same time, well, yeah, you're going to pay for it. And, you know, ultimately, at the end of the day, I don't know, maybe it's a wash. I mean, computers are just tools to get stuff done. And regardless of whether it's Mac or PC, I think there are definitely more similarities than there are differences. So if you hate Apple, that's fine. Just remember, we're all kind of in this one together. Anyway, I am, of course, curious as to your thoughts. Obviously, this is an Apple-centric podcast episode, so they're going to be very divisive. I just ask that you please be civil down in the comments below. Also, if you're interested in audio-only versions of these podcasts, I have them available for Patreon supporters. Plain MP3 downloads, Plus, you get private RSS feed access. Throw that URL into the podcast player of your choice. And these episodes usually show up a few days before they arrive on YouTube, so it helps support the channel. Maybe it's something you'd be interested in. I'd appreciate you checking it out. In any event, if you liked the video, I would appreciate a thumbs up. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram @thisdoesnotcomp. And as always, thanks for watching.